from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
I invite you to open your Bibles to John chapter 2 as we conclude this series that we've called A Meal with Jesus. We've looked at a number of different examples where Jesus, in the context of a meal or around the dinner table, shares something, teaches something, or others learn something about who he is and what it is that he wants us to do. Sharing meals are very communal. It's an experience of relationship, of community, of family. It is a kind of relationship or even emotional connection that happens around food. For example, if you invite someone over to your home, you're normally a little bit thoughtful about who that might be. And you certainly, let's say it's someone you don't know very well, you certainly aren't going to serve probably barbecue ribs or corn on the cob or something messy like that because it's hard to be real dignified and eat corn on the cob. Now, we do that with our friends. We do that with our family. And that's the point, is that when we share a meal, it's very genuine, it's very human, it's very real. Well, not only do we share meals like that, but our community ritual events, sort of the extended family type of crowd, does something very similar, that it's usually by invitation. There's very often food involved. And the purpose of the gathering is to say that something that is happening is important, that it's important to us. So, for example, birthday parties. We invite people over for a birthday party, and, well, it would be a lame birthday party if there wasn't at least cake. Certainly there's food. It kind of goes with it. We do that for reunions. We also do that for holidays. So again, we invite people to an experience, and then we celebrate or share that, often with food involved. Weddings certainly are no exception. Weddings and funerals really can teach a lot about what a culture values or what their priority is or what's important. Those are very important things that we do. And the reason that brides dream about the kind of dress they'll have and the decorations, and the reason that a lot of money is spent and often a lot of time is taken to make things just right, is because we're signaling this is important to us. This matters to us. The people involved are very special to us. So we tend to plan, organize, or build around such things. Well, in John chapter 2, there is a wedding. Now, every culture may be different in how they celebrate it, but generally all cultures mark this as an important life experience. So there's a couple that's getting married. The two families are celebrating that. They have invited others, and they have invited Jesus and his mother and his disciples. So in John chapter 2, verse 1, we read, "On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding." Now, I might be reading a bit too much into the verse, but especially considering what happens next, it sounds like what John says is Jesus' mother was there, but then he specifically says Jesus and the disciples were invited. So it sounds like that Mary is one of the friends of one of these two families that are celebrating this wedding. And if you're really a good friend, you don't get to sit in the front, you're in the kitchen, right? It sounds like Mary is there because she's serving or she's helping in some way, she's being a hostess in some way, whereas Jesus and his disciples are what we would call traditional guests. They've been invited, and there doesn't seem to be any expectation for them to bring anything or serve in any way, but rather they're simply guests. So, verse 2, "And both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.'" This is the second hint that perhaps Mary was not just an invited guest, but perhaps a treasured friend or a close friend, so that she's there helping. Because if she's just a guest, how would she know that they're out of wine? This seems to be a behind-the-scenes problem. This discussion that we're about to look at together is going to take place that is so far behind the scenes in the kitchen, if you will, that the head waiter will not be aware of it. And so this seems to be the kind of situation where Jesus and his disciples are invited guests. They're somewhere in that crowd, and then Jesus' mother, Mary, goes over and says, Can I talk to you for a minute? Pulls him off to the side or says to him very quietly, "They don't have any wine." The third reason why it would seem to me that Mary is one of the helpers or hostesses, a close friend of one of the families, is because not only does it not say she's invited, but that she's there. That's the first thing. Secondly, she's aware that they're out of wine in a way that it would seem no one else knows. Thirdly, she cares. If she were just a guest, it wouldn't be her responsibility, but it wouldn't even be her place. You don't want a guest getting up and announcing to everybody, we're out of wine, or where's the wine, or how come we don't have any, or throwing the doors open to the kitchen, hey, we're out of wine. That's not what you'd want a guest to do. But if there's a hostess or a friend who's helping, hey, we're out of wine, we got a problem here, let's try to fix this before anybody else finds out, that seems to be the place that she's in. So she says to Jesus, they have no wine. Points out the problem. Now, this is something that is absolutely delightful. You remember when we talked about how Jesus fed the multitude of 5,000? Jesus is the one who said, hey, everybody's hungry. What should we do? Should we give them something to eat? He presents the problem, and the disciples are like, well, I don't know. There's nothing we can do. I mean, this is a desolate place. There's no Allsup's here to buy anything, or even if we don't have the money, even if we had the money, there's no place to buy anything, and all we have is this little boy's loaves and fishes. And so, though the disciples had seen many miracles by then, they just shrugged their shoulders like, I don't know what we're going to do. Their faith hasn't gotten to the point where they can say, well, we can't handle it, Jesus, but we know you can. I mean, if you can heal the sick and heal the blind and calm the sea and walk on water, then you can handle lunch. But they haven't gotten there yet in their faith. Conversely, quite differently, Mary's already there. Of course, you don't have to tell Mary who Jesus is. She absolutely had a front row seat to knowing Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And so the difference is she doesn't ask Jesus to fix anything. She doesn't say, oh, what are we going to do? She simply presents the problem to Jesus. They have no wine. There is in that quiet statement an assurance that Jesus can handle it. She's way ahead of the disciples. Of course, she certainly had a head start, to say the least. They have no wine. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. Modern readers sometimes read this and stumble a little bit with, wow, is Jesus being sassy? Is he being disrespectful to his mother? Because he says woman instead of mother or mom or Mary even, calls her woman. Well, tone of voice would mean a lot if we were to say today, woman? Well, that tone typically is followed closely by the crash of an iron skillet up against your head, because in our culture and in English, we use that word derisively when we say it that way. Woman, as if that's subservient or a put down or inferior, and that's a tragedy. Well, how do we know that Jesus is not speaking down to his mom? One, that would be way out of character for Jesus. Number two, this is the same thing that he calls her later in the Gospel of John. If you'd turn in your Bibles over to chapter 19, here Jesus is being crucified, his mother and others, but his mother specifically is weeping there at the foot of the cross, seeing her son in such tremendous agony. And in John 19, verse 26, we read, when Jesus then saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her into his own household. He calls her woman again. Is Jesus being disrespectful toward Mary at the cross? Woman? That didn't make sense at all. He is in tremendous agony. He has mercy and grace for the thief on the cross who had started insulting him and then asked to be with him when he comes into his kingdom. Jesus is merciful and graceful to him. Would he not be merciful and graceful to his own mother? It's truly hard to believe that the word mother in verse 27 is somehow derisive or a put down or inferior. This is the tragedy of the modern world, in that we use a word differently or have robbed a word or perhaps polluted a word that's used in the Bible. The first time the word woman appears is found in the book of Genesis. If you turn briefly to Genesis chapter 2, here God has created Adam and Eve, man and woman, in his image. And then in chapter 2, he says it's not good for man to be alone. So Adam looks at all the animals, tries to see if there's a companion suitable for him, and there's not. So God causes a deep sleep to come over Adam, takes from his side a rib, and then fashions a helper, according to verse 20, a helper suitable for him. So, verse 22, what is this suitable helper that is custom designed by God himself in the absolute perfection of the garden? What is this creature called? For Adam is a man, he's called man. What then should we call this creature? Well, the Bible says, the Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. So the word woman is a derivative word, or that it is derived from or an extension of the word man. Woman is how that works in English. Is Adam being derisive? Is Adam in a situation where he has realized he's alone and that it's not good and that he has named every animal possible and no one's suitable to be his companion? He falls into a sleep and he wakes up, and there is the first female who would be like him. She would be absolutely in perfection, and that she would be absolutely not only beautiful on the outside in perfection, but absolutely beautiful on the inside. Imagine the look in her eyes. Imagine the innocence and the wonder, the delight that she would have as a perfect woman. When Adam sees this creature that has been given to him by God, he is so overwhelmed and he is so amazed, and he names her woman. That means that in the Bible, the word woman is the greatest compliment. It is the biblical, divine description of man's greatest gift here on earth. Salvation would be our greatest gift from Jesus Christ. But in terms of creation, the greatest thing that God has ever done in creation for mankind is womankind. So the word woman is not derisive, not biblically. Now, the world may spin things around and turn things around, but that's not how God uses that word. And so going back to John chapter 2, when he says woman, it is a word that describes someone who is infinitely valuable. It is a word of tenderness. It is a word that describes a unique and sacred status. That's who Mary is. She is woman, and that is absolutely wonderful. Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. Why are you telling me? I'm not involved. And again, there's, if we're counting, I guess this would be the fourth hint, that Mary feels a responsibility to the problem that they've run out of wine, where Jesus does not. A guest would not. It isn't the guest's fault, nor is it the guest's duty to solve such a problem. But if you're one of the hostesses, helpers or otherwise, then that's what you're there for. And so he says it is not his responsibility, and then uses this word, my hour has not yet come. So Jesus is at a meal. It is a celebration meal that is in tandem with or combined with a wedding. What's interesting about this meal is that what Jesus is going to do is outside of the communal aspect of the meal that's being shared around this wedding. In other words, what's happening is not with everybody else. It's not around everybody else. It's just with Jesus and a select few. But his hour has not yet come. Now, verse 5, his mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. This is hint number 5. Why is she addressing the servants unless she has some sort of responsibility? Again, she shows such a tremendous faith that she doesn't need answers. Just simply knows that Jesus is the solution. Whatever he says to you, do it. Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water. Now, another question that's interesting in this text is, why does Jesus say, what does that have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And then he ends up solving the problem. It's almost like, well, which is it? If this isn't your problem and it's not the time for it, then what, 5 minutes later, now it's time? Well, John uses, this is the first time, but throughout the book of John, we'll see Jesus saying, or John saying as the inspired narrator, his hour has not yet come. In John 17, as Jesus is praying before his crucifixion and praying specifically about enduring the crucifixion, he'll say, Father, my hour has come. So John 17 tells us that the hour he's talking about is crucifixion, when he's going to give his life, when he's going to fulfill his purpose, and that will lead to his resurrection and victory over sin and death. So it's the big thing. It's the big moment. It's the when everything is done. As Jesus said on the cross, it is finished, and then gives up his spirit. So apparently then that suggests that what Mary has in mind is bigger. Some ultimate revelation, some show him you're the Messiah, something bigger than what Jesus is willing to do. She asks this or makes this request in, at least in her mind, in the category that will not be fulfilled until Jesus is crucified. So whatever it is that she might have in mind sounds like a lot bigger picture than what Jesus is willing to do. So he won't do that, this bigger picture, but he will solve this simple problem of the fact that they've run out of wine. So then John mentions to us these pots off to the side, these pots that are customary for purification. So the Jews, whenever they would come in, they would dip their hands in water, and they would have already washed physically, like with soap and dirt and grime, getting that off of them. But then there's the purification pots inside the house where they dip their arms in and then allow the water to run down their arms and off their fingertips. And it was more symbolic about how they were cleansing themselves in preparation of eating. That way what they touch is not unclean that they would put in their bodies. So they're not talking about the being unclean like your hands are grubby, dirt and everything, and you get dirt and germs on your food, but rather the spiritual, that you were washing yourself of any potential spiritual uncleanliness. Like in the law of Leviticus, you're going to have various laws about what you can't touch, you can't handle. If you do, it makes you unclean. And certainly if you were to do that and then ingest it, then you would be unclean from the inside. This is all a concept that the Jews had developed, mostly of their own. There were some purification rituals and rites having to do with the Old Testament temple and there's sacrifices to be made and so on. But this is going to be something that they've sort of stretched from there to a ceremonial cleansing. So it's unlikely that they're physically dirty as far as actual dirt and grime would come off of their arms, their hands. But in the Jews' mind, their spiritual uncleanliness would go into these pots. I can remember being a very young man and seeing someone be baptized, and I was fascinated to go stand and peek over and look in the baptistry because I was looking to see about all the filth that had washed off of them. I always figured if you baptized a sinner, they'd leave a ring around the baptistry, all them sins coming off. Well, that is what happens spiritually, but it's not a matter physically. So even though it's not a physical filth, the Jews would have seen this as spiritual filth. Therefore, these pots would have been nasty. Arguably, to the Jewish mind, it would have been nastier than if it would have had dirt and mud and whatever floating around in it. This is the worst kind of uncleanliness. So Jesus has them take that, and then they pour water in it, fill the water pots with water, so they fill them up to the brim. As Jesus does, he's not explaining himself. He just simply tells them to do, and then they're acting in obedience or faith. They're doing what Mary said. Whatever he says, do it. Well, he says it, they're doing it. When they're finished, then in verse 8, he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the head waiter. Jesus, as far as we can tell in the text, hasn't said anything, hasn't touched anything, hasn't gone over and waved his hand over these pots, nothing. He just said, fill it up, okay, now draw some and take it to the head waiter. These servants, they're all Jews. They know what these pots are for. These pots are terribly polluted to a Jewish mind. Mary's faith is being echoed by the servants. She said, whatever he says, do. Now, this would be tough because you realize you're going to draw a cup of water, a ladle of water, out of the purification pots. That would have made this water absolutely spiritually filthy. You're going to draw that water, and you're going to take it over to the head waiter for him to drink. This would make the head waiter, or whoever drinks it, in this case, the head waiter is probably their supervisor. You're going to make that person spiritually unclean. There are curses on those who would cause someone else to be unclean. Jesus later even describes the Pharisees, pronounces woes on them, because he says they're like hidden tombs, because to walk over a tomb is to make oneself unclean in the Old Testament. And if it's unmarked, well, that's not fair, because now you've been made unclean, you don't even know it. So what Jesus tells them to do is outrageous. They're supposed to take spiritually polluted water, take it to someone without saying anything, and allowing them to drink it, causing them to be spiritually unclean, to cause them harm spiritually. That's the way the Jewish mindset would work. There's a wonderful story called Anne of Green Gables, a wonderful book series about a young redheaded young lady growing up in Canada in the the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. And there's a scene there where she had left the cloth off of the rising bread dough, the cheesecloth, and a mouse had gotten in the pudding, actually, I guess, and had drowned. She saw that, lifted the mouse out, threw the mouse away, but obviously the mouse had swam around and died in this bread pudding type of material. Well, she doesn't say anything. She doesn't want to get in trouble, because that's why she's supposed to have covered it and didn't, because she forgot about it. Well, they have a guest over, the school teacher, and they're serving the meal, and then they serve the pudding, and she's all keyed up because she's torn between, do I confess that I had left it uncovered and a mouse got in it, or do I not say anything and not get in trouble, but let somebody eat something that a rat or mouse has died in? So she just waits, and then the guest who's going to eat it first gets a spoonful, and then Anne with an E explodes, don't eat that, and scares everybody. It ends up being a pretty funny scene that goes along with her character, because she just can't stand letting her friend and school teacher mentor eat something that she knows is unclean, even if the other person doesn't. That's what's going on here, but arguably worse for the Jewish mindset, because it's a spiritual uncleanliness. So their faith and trust in Jesus here is amazing, because they carry through with what he says. So verse 9, when the head waiter tasted the water that had become wine, because can you imagine the servants flinching? Now, we don't know when it turned to wine. Don't know if it was as soon as they poured it in and they could see it. So when he said take it, they're like, oh, wow, it's already wine. If it's while they carried it, if it's while the head waiter drank it. Generally, it seems like God acts when we submit, when we trust. That certainly would be at least when they're carrying it to the head waiter, but it doesn't say. Well, verse 9, he tastes the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it came from. Because the servants were not about to tell him where it came from. No way. But the servants who had drawn the water